Hello, here I am in perhaps my favourite cafe in South Kolkata in Gariad called The Roastery. So I've just had a double espresso because I'm a coffee fiend. It's not enough to have it at the place I'm staying. When I come out, maybe work on a bit of work because this is a working holiday, so to speak. This is where I come. So let's see, a little update. On Sunday I'm meeting with a historian who's also located in South Kolkata, but he runs a website that's called Purono Kolkata, a history of old Kolkata. And why is that important? Well, because he does it semi-professionally and he is completely across historical documents. I've already been working through the State Archive and also at the Central Library of Kolkata University. But he is particularly informed as to the so-called military orphanages and upper schools. Prominent among them here in West Bengal, in Kolkata, being Kidapur House. Now, Kidapur House doesn't actually physically exist anymore, but the grounds where it was are currently St. Thomas Boys School. And I've already visited it out there on my last trip. But even though I know something about the history there, I'm intrigued to find out a little bit more. Because as you may be aware, Francis J. Grant, the Irishman, who was in the Bengal Army and came from Waterford in the late 1700s to this part of the world where the East India Company had set up operations, and he was responsible for various kinds of territorial battles, which I spoke about last time, involved in the so-called Anglo-Burmese Wars, and there were 3 of them, allied with the Kingdom of Manipur. So that's currently another state of India, but at that stage it was a buffer kingdom, I guess, between then colonial India and Burma. And so he fought under the Manipur levy. So that was Gambhir Singh's Raja Gambhir Singh's Manipur levy. So I already know about that side of the history, the Irish side, so to speak. But I know less about the mothers of the children, such as that first generation of grandchildren that were not quote-unquote legitimate and that were born of local women. This was not uncommon, this was extremely common, particularly in the 1800s onwards. The British began to see it as the quote-unquote Eurasian problem, which itself is an interesting way of looking at it. So they're that generation of children that were sired, so to speak, by Francis Grant, prominent among them Frederick Grant, that is Una's father. So while we do not know the identities of the mothers, because it's very likely at least 2, and they're very likely of Muslim background, because it was unusual for Hindu women to break caste, so to speak. It was much more common for British men to have mistresses, and they were referred to as bibi. I hope you can hear me okay in this busy cafe. So they were referred to as bibi or mistresses. Another word that's used is concubine, obviously. But they formed their own society in a sense, and they typically were not seen in public if they cohabited with their British master, to put it that way. But they definitely socialized amongst themselves, and they had some degree of agency. They just don't typically appear in the documents because whilst unofficially these relationships were condoned and seen as necessary due to the lack of quote-unquote European women who were willing to come out to this part of the world, perception that they wouldn't survive the weather, for example. It was something quite stigmatized. And that's more than just that generation. But effectively, that's how it is that we have some mixed heritage in the Bell line, so to speak, through the Grands. And so when I meet with this historian, who's a lovely, elderly Indian man, very generous of him to accept me into his home and to introduce me to his wife, I'm hoping to get more insight as to the realities of what it was like being called an orphan. I suspect that the children were, if Francis wasn't cohabiting with these women, with these bibis, I suspect that they were placed there when he died, because that's how they would have been declared orphans. However, it was also not uncommon as a practice for children, nevertheless, of native mothers to be taken from the influence of the native women and to be placed in such military orphanages in general. Because it was seen that between the bazaar and the barracks that they weren't going to have a proper education or upbringing, and in particular that they couldn't be left with their mothers because that would be disadvantageous both to the authorities and to the children being under the influence of natives. So it's a quite tricky history to navigate. It's very interesting. You might wonder why look back. It's part of family history, and there's different ways of looking at it. We're living in an age where it's much more common to have mixed relationships, and for people to move around, and for those forms of stigma to no longer be attached to people because of mixed heritage. But of course, during this period, being that first generation of so-called Anglo-Indians was not in any way socially advantageous. Of course, they did gain in education, and in subsequent generations, notably Unas, through marriage and alliances, they were able to improve their social condition. But even today, here in India, Anglo-Indians occupy a kind of ambivalent position. And I've met with some people in the social assistance centre for Anglo-Indians here, and it's very interesting to hear their stories. So I'm meeting with them again after I meet with the historian. They mostly are of Christian background, whether Catholic or Protestant, and they very much uphold those traditions. They listened a little bit to the story of the bells as I retold it through what I gleaned from my mum, Josephine, who always maintained that there was a connection to India, by the way. And so in a sense, I'm doing that sort of weaving between what I know from my childhood. There are obviously a lot of gaps. Fortunately, various cousins provided some information, and I think it's a lovely thing to do for future generations as well, to know something about their heritage, independently of individuals involved and how we might view them, that we do have a connection here. And that's part of a larger history, not just our own family history. So anyway, I thought you might enjoy an update. Signing off, I'm going to grab something to eat. Obviously eating here is very nice. There's always an array of different things, and I'm gaining weight. Back in Sydney in a couple of weeks, and I'll see family in Perth before then. Take care.